To welcome back Diana Lautenberger to our lecture series. As you may remember, Ms. Lautenberger manages the AAMC Gender Equity Portfolio, which includes research, education, and projects to promote equitable working environments, as well as developing resources for marginalized populations in academic medicine. And her portfolio takes an intersectional and gender expansive approach to addressing gender equity issues in higher education and STEM fields. Um, she also is part of the AAMC's team dedicated to unconscious bias training and education, and is certified as an educator in this area. I would like to welcome back Diana Lautenberger to the second part of our series here. And this one is going to be confronting dominant culture to create an inclusive environment and foster belonging. Thank you, Diana, for joining us again. We look forward to your talk.
Thanks so much, Dr. Philpotts. I just want to make sure everyone can see the slides and they're not in funky mode. Okay, thanks so much. Sorry again about the technical difficulties. Even after years of presenting on Zoom, it always keeps us on our toes. It is so great to be back for this second session in our four-part session. I got the chance to meet some of you in person last time, some of you on the Zoom for our unconscious bias session. So really excited to continue the conversation today. I want to just level set and bring us to our training when we think about why we go through all of these different sections, all of these different concepts and terms. And really just want to level set with where we are today on April 3rd in 2025. We are in some really challenging times right now, where many of the words on the screen right now are divisive or being perceived as divisive. Sometimes they are outright illegal. And I just want us to all kind of sit with that for a moment and know that we are all here to try and learn something really in the service of being better people ourselves, but also trying to support the people that are around us. And that's really what belonging is all about. And so I just want to level set that everything that we're talking about, these are Diana Lautenberger's views. And I know that this can be really, really challenging to kind of know what the line is right now with so much activity and anti-DEI information that is out there right now. But in our view, in my view, just because there's a new administration and some, confusing information out there, it doesn't mean that bias or racism or sexism has gone away. So this is really calling us into the work even more. And so I always start out with this framework. It has become a little bit complicated now, but this really helps us understand our journey through these four parts in our series, where we have to start out by acknowledging that there is exclusion and harm that are happening on our campuses with our learners, with our faculty, with our staff, our coworkers. And we can't truly get to inclusion and belonging where everybody feels like they can contribute, everybody feels like they're safe, unless we explore some things. And so that's really why we started with the unconscious bias training last time. And we're going to move through some of these concepts over our four sections together, thinking about how those biases come out as microaggressions, how that creates dominant culture, and really our opportunity to interrupt that is through allyship, which we'll talk about on the next session. And that's truly how we start to create those cultures of respect and well-being. So I always think it's important for us to just level set and think about how are all of these terms being connected? And again, we've done a lot of reflecting and thinking inside the WMC over the last few weeks about what needs adjusting, what terms should we maybe not talk about so much. But we all have engaged in a learning space together. And so that really tells us that we need to continue to talk about these things, these concepts in an explicit way, in ways that we would have talked about them prior to January 20th, in a way, again, that's going to help us see our colleagues in a more respectful light, that's going to help everybody feel like they belong. And ultimately, it's going to help us provide better patient care, because that's really what we're here for. So I know that's kind of a long preamble, but I just want to make sure and acknowledge and really hold that space of where we are when we're thinking about this work. And so, a couple other level sets just to start thinking about what we're going to do over the next 90 minutes or so, a little bit less now, is start to get ourselves in the right headspace. So, all day for many of you who are physicians and scientists, your entire day, your entire training is predicated on being right and getting the right answer, right? People's lives are at stake because of that. We trust you and we rely on you to get it right, to know what you're doing in terms of patient care. And equity and inclusion work is a little bit different. This is tough stuff. This is tough work. There's no one right way to get there. And we are going to make mistakes. We are going to say the wrong thing. And we're going to have some confusion. It's not always going to be a linear or logical process about how we start to understand how dominant culture works or what else needs to be understood within us so that we can help hold that space for others and to be allies. So it is not simple. It is not quick. It will take time. But as long as we allow ourselves some of that space and grace, the learning will come. We just need to allow ourselves to sit in some of that discomfort. And this can be pretty uncomfortable stuff because for some of us, it is really calling into question some things that we have known to be the case or that we know to be the way that the world is for our entire lives. And that could be really, really difficult. And so I just want to say from the outset, although we will be raising some maybe difficult concepts for some folks, we are in a supportive space. We are not here to blame anyone or shame anyone or to make anyone feel bad about themselves. We are here to support one another and to think about how we can do that work internally. So again, we can make the space in our cultures more equitable and inclusive for everyone. And so that's important for those of us who do have some of these advantaged identities. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means, really, that we need to share some of that space and power. And so that calls us to come into maybe a different zone. Some folks may be familiar with this type of learning model. It goes by a lot of different names. I like the comfort, stretch, and panic zones. And so for our training today, we want to make sure that we are in the stretch zone. The comfort zone is, yep, I know all that. I'm really comfortable. I'm relaxed. Maybe it's even a little bit boring. Nothing is challenging about that work. And so we want to stretch a little bit more. We want to get to that space where, that's new. I haven't thought about it that way. Maybe that's demanding a little bit more from me emotionally or intellectually, but it's going to engage us and it might be a little bit tiring. What we don't want to do is get into the panic zone where some of this new information might be overwhelming or scary. And that's because that's not going to help us learn the best. And so it becomes really important for us to think about, and I would encourage all of us to take a moment and just pause and think about what it feels like in your body when you are becoming defensive. What does it feel like in your body when you are reacting to things that are scary or maybe different? Maybe we get a little bit hot. I know that my ears always get bright red and hot. I might feel a little bit of a pit in my stomach. And I would just encourage folks if we are feeling like we are getting into that argumentative, resisting, there's no way that that can be true, that we try to return back to that growth zone. So we may need to breathe, you may need to get up and walk around. But really, it's important for us to listen with the intent to understand. So often we listen with the intention to respond and to often refute. But we really want to try and understand, especially if other folks are sharing their experiences with us. And we're really just here again to support each other and to take care of ourselves, not necessarily dialogue or debate or argue with one another. And so that's just a little bit of a setup for the time today. I don't mean for that to be overly scary. We're not going to be going through scary things today. But sometimes, and I think especially again in the last couple of weeks, we've seen how some of these concepts and terms can really elicit strong reactions from people. And our intention is really to learn, again, with an eye toward inclusion and with an eye toward creating a safer environment for everyone. So what we're going to do today is really build off of what we learned in our first session together around unconscious bias, which we took a really deep dive into to really understand how it comes biologically, where it comes from in our brains. And we're going to build on that and understand how those biases are also informed by our identities and which of those identities can come with maybe more or less power. Or another term we'll talk about is privilege, or some people use the word advantage. And then we need to think about how that all relates to this sense of belonging and how do we create belonging within our organizations where people can really feel like they're valued and that they can contribute. And one of the things that is in direct conflict or serves as a barrier to belonging is this concept of dominant culture. And so we'll want to think about and we'll call out a couple of particular types of dominant culture that we have in academic medicine, which is going to be really important for us to understand how dominant culture functions through microaggressions. And we'll talk a little bit about that and then have some time for a breakout together and then some question and answer at the end. All right, so we'll jump right in here. Best place to start, I think, is at the beginning, just understanding what privilege is. And this concept has become really complicated over the past couple of years. And I think it's in the term, and I think that that's valid because privilege has a very specific connotation. And so sometimes when we're talking to folks about privilege, it doesn't quite land because maybe I didn't grow up in a socioeconomic situation that allowed me a lot of privilege. You know, I wasn't born with wealth. I can't imagine myself as coming into a space as someone with privilege. And that's why a lot of folks use the word advantage, of that there is this invisible advantage based off an identity that you carry with you. And so, you know, there's lots of ways for us to think about privilege or advantage. And all we really need to know about it is that it's just some social capital that some people have based solely off an unearned identity. And that part is really important because there are privileges that we do have that are earned. If you're a physician, a scientist, you have an advanced degree, those are things that are earned advantages, obviously. But we want to think about those things that are unearned. And so if we're not constantly reminded of it every day, that's probably a sign of an advantage. I am reminded probably every day that I'm a woman. If it's somebody catcalling me, making comments about my body or appearance, or interrupting me in a meeting, that is a constant reminder, right, of this, of an identity that I have. I don't really think every single day about being white. And I'm trying to get a lot better at that. And that's part of my journey and part of my privilege journey. And so that's an area that I probably have a little bit more advantage, right? Because it's not in my face all the time. And so it's important for us to understand around privilege or advantage. It's not saying that you haven't had struggles. It's not saying that you haven't worked hard. Privilege is not about having something extra or coming from wealth. It's about not having barriers to those certain spaces or opportunities purely based off of your identity. And I think that that's a really, really critical piece for us to understand. It is a way that we walk through the world differently. There's a story that I share from a few years ago. This was in the before times when we were all in the building together. I went out to lunch with a good friend of mine. He's a white man, and it's pertinent to the story. I don't just introduce people like that. But he's a white man, so we order our sandwiches. He gets his. I'm still waiting for mine. It takes forever. And I'm standing next to that, you know, wall of chips that every sandwich store has. And I'm saying, oh God, I forgot to get chips. I love the jalapeno spicy ones. And so we're sitting there, and my friend says, you want those chips? I was like, yeah, I want those chips. So he takes the chips, he goes to the cashier and says, my friend has been waiting for her sandwich for a really long time, so we're going to take these chips. And the person behind the counter says, okay. And I had just never in my whole life considered how I could use my privilege to just steal chips from sandwich places, right? And it was this watershed moment for me where I realized that there's not anything that he's smarter than me or that has more talent than me or has better ideas than me. He walks through the world differently than I do, where that situation is an option for him. And so that is another way that we can also think about privilege is the way in which we are walking through the world is different, where some folks are swimming with the tide. Yes, you are, moving your arms and yes, you are working, but you're also being carried by the tide, where some folks are not only not swimming with the tide, but maybe swimming against the tide. And so, with that understanding, it really helps us think about some of the backlash that we've seen, and especially now the direct backlash and dismantling that we're seeing of equity movements is in direct response to that, where if you've had privilege or advantage, if you're used to existing in society up here and everyone else is kind of down here, when we're asking for equity, that looks and feels like discrimination, even though it's not. That's still this zero-sum way of thinking about the resources that we have, the space that we have. And so again, we tend to get into this black and white or this side or that side, very binary senses of you're either privileged or you're not privileged. When in reality, we're really complex individuals, right? Human beings have so many facets to our identities that we can't be put into just one category. And so we really encourage folks, and I loved this Wheel of Power and Privilege from Sylvia Duckworth, because it really speaks to this idea of that we can have multiple identities, both that have power in our society and no power in our society at the same time. And so I really like this wheel because it shows, and this is not all identities, of course, this is just some, I recognize that, but it shows those identities that have the most power, the most agency, the most voice in our United States society, literally centered in the middle, right? And then it also shows for those same identities which ones are very literally marginalized on the outside. And for some of us, we could be in the middle, in the center of the circle, on the outside of the circle, and somewhere in between. And it gives us this sense again for the more categories that we are in the center of the circle, the more advantage we have walking through the world. Again, not saying that you haven't encountered your own struggles. And so sometimes when we have longer workshops, this is a really powerful point of reflection. And I would encourage folks to think about doing this in the future, is really thinking about these identities, and thinking about which ones do you think about most or least often? Which identity do you feel like you're most aware of at work? Which identity do you think has the strongest effect on how others perceive you? And which identities do you think might be reflected in your professional style or your leadership style? What really comes out? And so again, this becomes that interpersonal connection that we can have an understanding that we're all coming from different frames of reference. And our positionality changes a little bit depending on what context we're coming into. And so I find this really important when we're talking about privilege or advantage, because again, we don't want to get into the situation where it's either you have it or you don't. We're so much more complex than that. And that becomes really, really critical when we get to talking about allyship, and how that can contribute to belonging. All right, so this term of belonging, what does this really mean? And I want everyone to think about a time where you felt like you belonged. We could even have folks drop that in the chat. I know we got started just a little bit late. Normally, I would like to have people come off mute and share about a time where you felt like you belonged, right from that instance. When I think about it, it was when I joined the Pride Center at my on my college campus. Walking into that Pride Center and getting to talk with the other folks, was like, yes, These are my people. And so if you can all think about that and feel that in your bodies about what it felt like when you belonged, there's an ease to it, there's a naturalness to it, and there's a comfort to it. And so belonging, especially when we think about it in an organizational context, is that experience of being accepted and included. But maybe most critically, when we think about this organizationally, is valued by others. It's not just about the acceptance, but it's also the valuation as well. And we can also think about this as an interpretation of cues, right? This is not necessarily something that can be told to you. It's perceived, it's felt in that we can interpret this from cues that we get from others, cues that we are welcome in a particular context. And it's inferred based on observations, on interactions with other peoples, what kinds of values that we have as an organization. And so this becomes really important when we're talking about belonging, because we've got all kinds of organizational statements and people saying, you know, we want people to feel this sense of belonging, especially now, so much DEI work is kind of being recategorized and repackaged as belonging, when I don't even think we have quite a good understanding of what that means. So this becomes really important that it's not something that can be told, you belong here. It's something that is felt in how we interact interpersonally and what the culture really is like. And so it's important to understand then the ways that dominant culture subtly undermines these conscious intentions that our organizations have to, to increase belonging. That becomes really important for us to understand. And the research is really, really clear and really informative on why belonging is important. This is, again, not about just being extra nice to people, right? There is a direct correlation to how people can function and perform and their health when we think about belonging. And so when folks have that uncertainty about belonging, or as the article states, a definite certainty that they don't belong, that can contribute to a lot of organizational dysfunction, but personal isolation, not feeling like you can trust other folks, emotional distress, decreases in performance, health issues, loss of productivity. We know that belonging becomes really, really important when we're thinking about not just individuals feeling and feeling like they can do their best work, but also the organization itself. And so to understand belonging, it's important for us to understand how it relates to these other institutional efforts that we've had for decades around DEI. You know, belonging is somewhat new, right? We've only been talking about this for the past like 5 years or so, even though this has been a foundational concept around DEI for quite some time, but we kind of go in waves a little bit. And so the way that we like to think about belonging is that it's actually what happens when you have all three, diversity, equity, and inclusion, working in tandem. That's when you get belonging. It is the fourth resulting pillar when we have all three of these things. Now, again, there's a huge caveat here because I realize that for many organizations, we're not allowed to talk about this work or do this work anymore, but we can still appreciate and understand how this has happened in our organizations thus far, where for many of our organizations, we usually get two of these right, but we don't have all three working and firing on all cylinders all the time. And so sometimes we've got, equitable practices. So that's the policies and practices to make sure that things are fair. And we also have inclusion. We want to make sure that people feel included in those practices, but we don't have the diverse part of it. Excuse me. We have not actually diversified our workforce or our student body or whatever that means. And so that means we've got this oversaturation of similarity, this homogeneity, and oversimplified points of view, which the result of that is that the organization is not going to benefit and get all the benefits that we know diversity brings in terms of team science and patient care. All of those benefits that we've been talking about for the past several decades, we don't have that. Now, sometimes an organization is really good at diversifying their workforce or student body or community, and they're good at making folks feel like they're included, but we haven't figured out the equity piece, right? The actual policies and fairness practices. And so that's going to put us in a situation where the dominant group or the dominant ideology is always going to be deferred to for decision making or for the culture or how things actually go. And I think that this is maybe one of the most common practices that we see is that organizations bring in diverse folks, they try to make them feel included, but we haven't actually put it into our structures yet about how to do that, which means we're going to get that low morale in the organization, feeling like we're not being treated fairly. And another common situation that we get into is bringing diverse folks into the organization and trying to work on those fairness practices, but we haven't done the requisite work on inclusion, which means we're going to get that cultural assimilation. Everyone's going to need to assimilate to that dominant culture. When ultimately what happens there is that staff are not going to do their best work and they're ultimately going to leave the organization. And so I think those two examples help us understand what it looks like in practice at our organizations and why we haven't necessarily gotten to that point of belonging. You got to have all three of the stool to create the seat on top, which is really the belonging. And so feeling like a little bit more, feeling more into how do I sense the belonging? How do I get a sense of what that actually looks or feels like in our organizations? We can put it into a few buckets. And this just comes from organizational development work broadly, not just in academic medicine, but thinking from an organization perspective. We can think about it in a few buckets. I feel valued. I don't feel like I have to be the same as others to fit in. I feel like I'm empowered to make my own choices or decisions. That's that valued piece that's really, really important, not just the acceptance and inclusion, but the valued piece. The I feel safe piece. I'm safe to speak up, the psychological safety. I can challenge the status quo. I can challenge decisions, and I don't feel like I'm going to get punished for that. I don't have to modify my behavior to fit in. I can be my authentic self. We'll talk about that in a minute. And that harm is not tolerated. If somebody yells at a trainee, we don't tolerate that here. We address that head on, right? It also feels like I feel respected. I'm measured by my talents, my contributions, what I actually achieve, not necessarily other irrelevant things of, just who I know. That leaders are also conscious about the language that they're using. And that also, I feel that there's fairness. Excuse me. Um, I feel that the practices in the organization are really creating that more equitable environment. And we talk about the myth of meritocracy, which we'll talk about toward the end of this. So these are other ways for us to take that gauge of the belongingness in the organization. Now, I think it's really important here to clarify that belonging is not assimilation. And I think a lot of organizations can kind of slip into this unconsciously again. And when we think about assimilation, that might have a very particular historical context for us, maybe thinking about the picture on the left of the screen. But assimilation has some very subtle ways that it appears in our society and in our organizations these days, where assimilation is absolutely still happening. And that is really, really important that we're not slipping into that when we're thinking about belonging, where we're just trying to get you to feel really good about doing things our way, which is so often how organizations, I think, approach this idea of inclusion. And so all of these different examples of our assumptions, right? Our norms that we think are shared among all of us, or things that occur or happen that tell us those social cues again that maybe we don't belong. So So this really sets up, and with that background of what belonging looks like, what maybe it sounds like, what it feels like, that really sets us up for this conversation about dominant culture. And the way for us to understand dominant culture is the sense of cultures really reproducing themselves in their own images. Because we have a preconceived notion of what it looks like, what it sounds like, what it acts like to be in the dominant culture. And an example that I use for this is this really interesting statistic that in the United States, only about 16.5% of men are over 6 feet tall, which I just pause always there because it seems really low, right? It seemed really low to me when I first read this. So only 16.5%, not even 17%. When you look at Fortune 500 CEOs, that number is 60%. I don't think that there's anything necessarily amazing about taller people being more equipped to be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. And yet it is an example of how dominant culture reproduces itself. It has set a particular example, and this is just around something visual or physical in terms of height, but we've got all these other characteristics that continue to self-perpetuate themselves because they fit into this mold. Another example of this is that there are 25 Fortune 500 CEOs who are women. There are 23 that are just named John. And so again, we don't know if there's necessarily anything about folks who are named John, no shade to them, but that makes them uniquely qualified to be Fortune 500 CEOs. But it gives us this example of these cultural signifiers that we look for in the dominant culture to say, yes, that person is who we think of as a leader. There was another one, another example about just as many men having mustaches as women yeah, as Fortune 500 CEOs. And then I think all the men heard that and then they shaved their mustaches off because that went away after a little while. But there were lots of different examples of that. And so this is this cultural phenomenon known as dominant culture, which we've got a couple different ways that we can think about this. But essentially, it's that dominant culture is that some groups wield more power than other groups. A dominant culture is one that has an established set of norms, of values, and preferences that become the standard for an entire group of people, whether or not those are your standards, values, and preferences. And they may even contradict the folks who they are not in the dominant culture. And so we have to call these things out. We have to describe these things when we think about what prevents us from bringing our authentic and imperfect selves to work. Why do we feel like we can't necessarily be our authentic selves when we have these really complex organizational structures at work all the time? And so this becomes important for the future sessions when we talk about allyship, when we talk about responding to harm. We have to understand the water that we're swimming in. This is that water that we're swimming in to understand when we have moments that we can actually intervene in some situations of harm. Now, we talked about bringing our authentic selves to work. And I think, up until a few weeks ago, a lot of organizations, this was a cornerstone of their DEI work, right? Was that we want everyone to bring their authentic selves to work. And we got to question that a little bit about what that actually means, because as one of my favorite feminist writers, Jodi Ann Beery, says, is being authentic is going to privilege those who are already part of the dominant culture. It's much easier to be who you are when who you are is all around you. And so I certainly, as a queer woman, have my own struggles with dominant culture and things that I, come up against that are barriers to me. But it is easier for me to be at least a little bit of my authentic self at work than maybe potentially others. Not creating hierarchies here, but really thinking about and thinking deeply about what these dominant cultures really do and create. And so we have to understand that we use inclusion and exclusion consciously or unconsciously to really reward if someone is reinforcing that dominant culture, right? Going back to belonging as something that you sense, that you perceive, we use it the other way around as well, where we know that cultures use social inclusion to reward and exclusion to punish. And so, again, this is that way of dominant culture perpetuating itself and sending those signals again in the values, in the behaviors, in the things that people say, how we police each other's appearance. This is that way of enforcing those values consciously or unconsciously. And so it's really important for us to then think about how we break out of this cycle. Um, it's such an important point. If folks have read Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, he really accurately describes this of if we don't really deeply start to understand dominant culture, it's going to continue to function in this hierarchical way that it has so far. If we're not calling out white culture, male-centric culture, um, straight heterosexism, um, we're going to continue to perpetuate these particular cultures, right? Because we're not liberating ourselves. We are just trying to be the ones who are oppressing someone else. We just want to no longer be at the bottom of the totem pole. And I thought, we got to keep it light here. We got to put in some little funny things from Twitter because this can be really, really heavy stuff sometimes. But I call folks back to this quote over and over, which also comes from Paulo. When education is not liberating, the dream of the oppressed is to become the oppressor. And so this is why, and becomes so important when we're talking about dominant culture, why we have to call these things out. Because we spent a lot of time over the last decade, or at least the last 5 years, talking about racism and structural oppression. We didn't talk all that much about white culture, right? Or white supremacy culture. And that is, again, dominant culture playing itself out of saying, I'm okay to exist over here. You just want to have to not be on the bottom of, the rung, the ladder. You just want to try and get to a point where you have proximity to one of the other dominant cultures. And that is how our organizations function when we're not really trying to get at dominant culture, is that you're always trying to be proximal to whatever the dominant culture is instead of breaking out of that. And that really serves as a barrier to inclusion and ultimate to belonging. All right, so we've been talking about dominant culture. What is that? What are some examples of what that actually means? And so we'll call out just a couple of examples, but there are many more that have been, highlighted on some of these slides. But one that I think that we definitely have to call out is around white culture, since it's such a prominent dominant culture in our current environment. And so white culture gets to define the categories, gets to define what is white, and who is considered white changes over time. When we think back to Italian or Irish immigrants coming into this country, they were not considered white at the time. So white culture gets to decide what is the default, and then everything else is diverse outside of that, right? White culture defines what's considered normal. What's good parenting? What's a stable family? What does a good leader look like? What is their name? What is their height? What is an effective employee, right? And it's relational in this sense and defining others and defining other communities that are outside of that. It has a hyper focus on individuals as opposed to community. White culture has this focus on independence and autonomy are paramount, as opposed to maybe valuing the community or the group effort. That there is higher value in some ways of behaving, that we don't bring up conflict in public. We don't argue in public. We don't become emotional. We are overly polite. And that is the social way of dealing with particular situations. That there's certain ways of knowing things. An over reliance on the data and quantitative data as opposed to qualitative data. If you can't measure it, it's really not of value. And then really this right to comfort when we're thinking if that's space, if that's emotional comfort, if it's voice, if it's visibility. And so we can think about it in this as structural advantages where these white cultural norms and practices, they go unnamed, they go unquestioned. And again, we might look at this list and say, yeah, that all seems right to me, but we've never actually really had a conversation about that. Again, these are things that we are perceiving about dominant culture in our societal context. And so whiteness then is considered to be the default, it's considered to be universal. Um, and we get to continually change what that definition is and what those categories might mean. That's a lot. We're going to move on to another kind of dominant culture that we also have, and one that I think is particularly salient for medicine and science, which is around what Jennifer Berdal calls masculinity contest culture, or you can think about it as male-centric culture. We have this especially in medicine and science and higher education. When you look at rates of harassment, sexual violence, medicine is second only to the military in terms of the highest rates of sexual harassment and violence. And that is due to some dominant culture traits that we say are okay, or that we say are part of the culture here. And so we've got this ruthless competition. You're not going to trust anyone else. You're going to try and always crush your competition. You're either with us or you're against us. We don't show emotions here, show no weakness or doubt. Anger is the only emotion that is allowable, but we're certainly not going to let someone know if we don't know the answer. We're just going to kind of pretend or not speak up if we have any doubts about what the answer is. Got this overemphasis on physicality, lasting long hours, just thinking about that size again. The 6-foot CEO comes to mind again of just when we think about what these dominant culture norms are. And then around really putting work first, that work comes first and our personal lives and our work lives are separate. And that is not by accident. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but that you are a breadwinner. We're going to answer email, late at night or on the weekends, never taking time off, and having that really be a badge of honor, right? Well, I'm on vacation, but I can take the call, right? That is part of our dominant culture norms to say that that is a valued trait that we have. So we're all just going to check in because that was a lot. That might be a lot for some folks. And I want to just go back to our discomfort check. Again, we are not here to say for those of us, including myself, who belong to some of these dominant culture identities, we're not bad people. We suffer from these norms too. And we have to talk about these if we are truly going to make our environments supportive and inclusive for everyone. And so let's just take a pause and check in with ourselves emotionally. Are people feeling maybe angry, maybe curious, maybe validated? People might be jumping out of their seats wanting to argue with me about this or debate, which we're not here to debate. We're here to dialogue and discuss if you have questions about these things, but these are real phenomena that are going on in our cultures and societies. I see we've got someone who's raised a hand, and I was just going to offer to see if we have anyone who has some clarifying questions, would be happy to take a pause right here.
Hi, Diana. Thanks for doing this. If you go back a slide earlier, what you were discussing, but perhaps we can spend a little bit more time on this because, I mean, there is an expectation perhaps it's not said in a work environment when you're working in a very high functioning environment with very high functioning leaders who are available 24/7, you feel that you don't have a choice than
Yeah.
to emulate them. And you're right about that. You feel important when you are, out of the country and you're getting called, or you're in the air and you're getting called or texted or emailed, and you're responding to all those, that you feel, yeah, I'm still valued. May not be the right way of thinking,
Yeah.
but there is that connection. You're valued. The CEO is reaching out to you despite you being on vacation, or the president, because they think you're the only one who can do this, and I'm so good, I'm the
Mhm.
only one who can do this, but you're perpetuating that culture.
Yeah.
And the world is changing since COVID. People want boundaries, and I think sometimes it's a good thing. So the question is, how do you regulate yourself and how do you promote that kind of culture?
Right. Such a great question. Thank you for asking this. And I think you're right. We're in a totally different world after COVID in two opposite ways, where people are more connected and available and work the strangest hours than ever before. And yet, I think because of that, people working on their laptops until midnight and never getting out of their pajamas, for days and weeks on end. And I think because of that, we've started to learn and understand the value and importance of boundaries. So this is going to take time, but I think the way that I've seen it modeled really well is just to have the conversation with leaders. I've even seen in people's email signatures, given my work priorities and my leadership role, I respond to email out of normal business hours, but I do not expect anyone else to, right? Maybe that makes a difference. Maybe it doesn't. But I think the visibility and the action of actually seeing that someone has taken the time to call that out and to say that, is really important. And it's those little things that I think eventually change culture. Because you're right. For some people, for my boss, who is the chief academic officer at the AAMC, we are in incredible times right now where we're doing all kinds of legal action and we're having to respond to things in the moment. She has that conversation where she says, I'm doing things that literally need to happen overnight, last minute. We're working on really, really big stuff at the senior level. It is not my expectation that anybody else would do the same because our roles are very different, right? I'm not in a, I don't see patients, I don't save people's lives, so I don't need to be on call in that way. And so I think the way that we start to chip away at this is by just having the conversation, because the sticky situation is when we again take it for granted. When we say that this is assumed that this is the way that everyone else should behave. And so having leaders both say, I'm performing this way and this is when I do work, I don't have the expectation for you to. But then also modeling that behavior, or saying, I want you to take time off and I'm not going to bother you when you have time off, because that is your protected time, that you have those boundaries. So I don't think we have any perfect answers right now, but you'll probably hear me say it again and again. Having the conversation is the first way that we start to impact culture. Saying it out loud starts to pull away some of that power that these assumed norms have over us. So I'm not sure if that helped
No,
or.
no, no, thank you. But part of me thinks there is a subconscious. I mean, you've done your previous, which I really enjoyed, by the way, your unconscious bias, like the first one.
Yeah.
Sometimes I think, yes, when you think about it, you do not want to have expectations from others to respond on their vacation. Then I wonder subconsciously, when people are not responding to me and they are on vacation, should they be responding to this? This is, becoming an emergent situation. So yes, a lot, you said a lot of, I think having transparent, honest conversations is the first step.
Yeah.
even, even when you're not there.
Yeah. I think we've all
So
been in
thank
that
you.
situation. Yeah, we've all been in that situation of understanding what constitutes an emergency, right? And I've had to have that conversation with my boss, with, people that report to me of this is an emergency. This is not an emergency, right? And the point is, again, it's that it's having conversations and working and operating in ways that we have not previously. And we haven't done it previously for specific reasons, right? Because that's what our dominant culture says is that you're supposed to just accept all of these norms and just take that as the way that and it functions that way, right? Because that's the only way you can be successful. So these things are really, really important for us to talk about. All right, any other reflections or questions just at this point?
Well, I wrote in the chat about the role of hierarchy in affecting culture
Yeah,
because people's positions with their titles confer a great deal, a difference in power.
yeah.
So is clearly, no matter how you slice it, it plays a role in how you feel within that context. As on a personal basis, I'm partially retired, and I'm very often just ignored.
Mm,
It's if you're no longer part of the group because you're not like the group anymore.
right.
So it's hard to cope with, trying to figure out what you can do without sounding like sour grapes, and then still feeling that you have a little bit of power uh, as an individual within the context of that group.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And congratulations on being partially retired. That's exciting to get to new places in our lives. And I think that that is part of why inclusive leadership is so important. And as we start to get leaders who come from different backgrounds and have different perspectives and understand some of these challenges, maybe understand and approach hierarchy in a different way, with a different perspective, that is going to help change some of our organizations. Now, that's not to say that those of us who come from marginalized backgrounds, we don't take some of that on, right? It's not as if folks who have disadvantaged identities are, we totally get all of it, and I never say anything that's sexist whatsoever. That happens too, right? Where we have those same opinions. And so sometimes we have this idea that there's a silver bullet out there when we get, diverse people into leadership or, get diverse levels of leadership, that all of a sudden it's going to be solved. We have just as much work to do as everybody else. And so it is important for us to think about that too, that all of these different ways that dominant culture operates. And again, a lot of the time it's just trying to get proximity to whatever piece of the dominant culture you can. And that's that hierarchy, right? All right, appreciate these comments. And these are really tangible ways I think that we're seeing it all play out because we don't want this to just be an academic exercise. We want this to be specific and to think about how it actually occurs in our organization. And so to that point, thinking about when we're, these high level things of white culture, masculinity contest culture, like what does that have to do with the organization? How does that actually play out in the organization? Okay, maybe there's just like these hyper masculine bad apples who are out there harassing people. What does that have to do with me? I treat everybody with respect. What does that have to do with the organization? And it is important for us to understand how these norms play out in the organization, because as just a couple of folks have described, the dominant way of being is what ensures your success within the organization. And so if we're asking people to be authentic and to feel that sense of belonging, but we won't reward that within the institution. And so that actually plays out into the organization where we've got these particular kinds of norms, again, about how we're supposed to behave that contributes to some pretty serious organizational dysfunction where we've got some people who maybe are not the best leaders. Maybe they're really good at something else professionally, but they're not good at the function and performance of leading. We allow bullying, we allow identity-based harassment and biased comments. We maybe have this overly heterosexist climate. We've got low psychological safety when we allow these types of norms to continue. And as we've seen, this all comes back around and has harm to the individual, right? Both men and women. And I want to say, when we're just talking about gender as a dominant culture trait in particular, this is something we'll come back to again and again in the effort to not create an us versus them mentality. These norms really harm everyone. Even for those of us who are in those dominant cultures, it harms us too, because we are experiencing that exclusion ambiently, and it's in our environment. And so ultimately, we do see the impact. All of you can probably see this at other organizations you've been to, or in your current environment. There is burnout. There is low engagement. There is high turnover right now. There is poor mental and physical health. And so that all just starts the wheel over again when we're thinking about how that actually functions. So I was going to put folks into a breakout, but maybe we'll just do this since folks feel comfortable coming off mute, which is fantastic. That's what we want to go to. Sometimes I plan for breakouts just in case people can't. But I would love to hear some other examples from folks if you feel comfortable. What other aspects of dominant culture do you see? And we're not going to do the breakout. We're just going to kind of do this as a general group discussion. I named two examples of dominant culture. What other aspects of dominant culture do you see? Either maybe it might not be comfortable to talk about your current organization, but if you've seen it in other organizations, other departments you've been in, thinking about what that climate creates and what that norm creates. So I would love to have folks come off mute, or if you want to put something into the chat, describing a little bit more about other dominant cultures, aspects or behaviors that you've seen.
I think something that's very dominant is also religious affiliations. I think that's
Mm.
very embedded in American culture in the way that we plan our schedules and holidays, giving preferential dominance to Christianity, Catholicism, and I say that as a Catholic myself. But yeah, I've seen an improvement obviously over recent years, acknowledging that there's many other religions and providing safe spaces and acknowledging their holidays. But I think there's still a big disparity on the way that this is embedded in our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, that's a great example. There's been so many times where we've, gone to schedule something and we're trying to get better at this at the WMC, schedule something and somebody, says, well, that's Ramadan for me, or that's Rosh Hashanah, or, it's not even on our cultural calendars. The only thing that's on our calendar is Christmas break, right? So that's a great example. What else do folks want to raise? All right, I'm pretty comfortable with silence, but I won't torture everybody. Just wanted to make a little space for that. We can think about, we'll do the breakout sessions next time when we get everybody together in groups. Sometimes I feel like maybe people aren't into the breakout discussions, but like to hear other voices in the room and want to make sure that you all are participating and getting a lot out of it. So this helps us start to think about, we're going back to our graphic and we're connecting all of the dots between our unconscious biases and how those are informed by our privileges, our advantaged identities, and how that might come out as microaggressions. And this is another complicated term. We'll say this is complicated term number 7 of where the actual word doesn't really fully capture in the best way, I'm not sure, what these experiences actually are. And so we've heard lots of also confusion about the term microaggressions. For a lot of folks thinking like what they're describing is actually a macro aggression, or not really understanding what that term means. And so I like this way of describing it from Daryl Wing Su. Folks might be familiar with them. They do a lot of research and education around microaggressions. But the way we can think about microaggressions is really that they are these everyday, they could be verbal, they could be nonverbal. There are these slights, these snubs, these subtle acts of exclusion, which is another term that people have talked about for microaggressions, that regardless of the way that they present, they're communicating this very subtle, hostile, derogatory, or really negative message, trying to say that you are not part of this group. Really, it's the communication of the opposite of the belonging, right? Is that we're doing something, we're saying some kind of comment that is communicating that you are not part of the dominant culture here. And I think it's really interesting that a lot of people attribute the terminology to Daryl Wing Su, but it was actually a physician that coined this term, Dr. Chester Pierce, back in the 70s, to describe his everyday experience as a Black man in medicine. Of really thinking about the kinds of comments that people would say that, again, what we want to think about it's things that fly directly under the radar. And we're talking a little bit about microaggressions today, but we'll come back to this and talk a little bit more about it in the next section when we talk about allyship and when our opportunities to really interrupt microaggressions as allies. But this is important for us to understand what it is, because so often comments are made and they go completely over our head in terms of thinking about whether or not that was maybe something that was harmful to someone. So, there's lots of different examples, and everybody probably has an example on this call of something that they've received or that they've heard, or maybe even you've said, including myself. Many of times, these are unintentional things that are just informed, again, by our dominant identities, our biases, our privileges that think it's okay to say something like that. And so it comes out in a lot of different ways. If we use qualifiers to describe people, they're a great woman scientist instead of just a great scientist, asking people about how they got a particular position with the subtle inference that they shouldn't have gotten it, automatically assuming someone is married and that they're straight. You see a ring and it's, oh, so tell me what your husband does. Asking someone where they're from. Sometimes it comes out as intentionally, the intention was to be a compliment of saying someone is so articulate, but not understanding how that can really be harmful to someone. And there are, again, some really interesting examples that I've pulled from Twitter. I can't call it X. It's just, I can't. And we might have shown these to you last time if you were able to join us. But this one in particular, where this person gets into the elevator and a white man says, "Whose lab are you in?" "Mine." "No, I mean, who's the PI of the lab?" "I am." "Yeah, in what professor's lab?" "The Columbus lab, and I am Columbus," right? Like, this is obviously sexist that this person was saying, but there are no names being called. There's nothing outright, like a negative word, but this is implicitly assuming that because of who I think this person is, there's no way that they could be the PI of this particular lab. Or the other example from this physician, where a white woman leaves the bathroom and approaches them and says, I know you're on your break right now, but I want to tell you there's no soap in the women's bathroom. And so you can imagine, again, it is racist, given the appearance of this particular person, but someone's just making an assumption, an inference, an unconscious association based off of some aspect of their identity. And you could see how that would completely take you out of whatever you were trying to do that day. You know, whatever you were trying to show up and you just wanted to show up and see your patients, or, you know, do your scientific discovery. And you can imagine if that happened to you, how that would derail your entire day. And so what we really try to communicate to folks is the incredible mental and emotional impact that these experiences have on people, and that there is robust evidence and research that has talked about the real impact on the health of recipients of microaggressions. And so what we try to communicate to folks, because so often in these situations, it is, you know, well, let's assume good intentions. That's probably not what they intended. And to kind of rethink that a little bit, because when we continue to focus on the intentions of someone, we've taken away the focus and centering really the person that was harmed. And so we encourage folks to, when we're talking about microaggressions and when we're responding to harm, and this will come back to in our next session about what we actually respond to harm, is that the intent is not as important as the impact of the action. And that is one of our major takeaways when we're thinking about responding to harm, and why responding to microaggressions is such a powerful tool to start to dismantle the ways that dominant culture really keeps people out and keeps people from succeeding and keeps people from really being their authentic self. And so focusing on that impact becomes really, really powerful. And so again, we'll revisit this and microaggressions in the next section when we talk about allyship. But just to
This slide,
yeah,
this
go
slide,
ahead.
I think the word contribute to diminished mortality is wrong. It contributes to increased mortality, not less.
That's a great edit. I'll go back to the quote and I'll see. Yeah,
Because
if
microaggressions has a very negative impact on your life. And for that reason, you have an increased mortality, augmented
yeah,
morbidity, flattened
yeah.
confidence. So I think the word is wrong.
I
Sorry.
appreciate the copy editing. I'm sure Dr. Pierce would too, if they were here.
Thanks.
All right. All right, and so we'll come back to that again in the next session, but just to kind of start to come into understanding how we deal with this, we're going to talk about how we address microaggressions in the next one. But before we do that, we do also need to start to understand why this hasn't been resolved. Why aren't we doing this? Again, this session is the much more deep internal reflective session, where the first one was very active and the third one's very active, and this is one of our deeper, more internal ones. We have to understand that as human beings, and we talked about this last time, we know that we're designed to seek comfort and order. We want to be comfortable. We are always seeking that comfort. And so if we have comfort, we tend to plant ourselves there, right? Even if our comfort isn't all that comfortable. And I think we've talked about some of those examples of it may be comfort on the outset, but I'm still receiving and hearing things that I'm uncomfortable with. There are work norms and organizational norms that are uncomfortable for me, but this is the status quo, right? And so if we are comfortable in that moment, we're going to plant ourselves there, even if we secretly want for something better. And these are inherently uncomfortable conversations. And so this is not to excuse why we haven't had this, But I do think we need to give ourselves a little bit of space. Again, going back to our biology, going back to what we know about biases, unconscious biases, about why we may not want to lean into that discomfort. And this is inherently uncomfortable. And so it calls on us, those of us who have dominant identities, we're really the key to whether or not we're having these conversations, right? By not engaging in these conversations because we don't want to be uncomfortable, we're allowing these things to not be addressed. We are controlling whether or not these issues are being addressed. And so that's why we talk about dominant culture, because those who are in the dominant culture, if you are in that center ring, thinking back to the power and privilege ring, the rainbow graphic, we are really deciding what issues are discussed or resolved or not discussed and resolved. And I think we're really seeing that in the backlash now of we're uncomfortable with this. We don't want to talk about this. So we're going to make it illegal in many cases. And so that really helps us understand how structurally these things work. And so we can also think about this. Well, I think we have plenty of real world examples right now. I usually need to provide a little bit more background for how the resistance to this changing of the status quo occurs. And one way we can think about this is this concept known as the habitus. And this is, again, those familiar ways of perceiving and interpreting the way we do things around here. What is right? What is valued? How are we supposed to behave? What gets you promoted? What gives you extra ear or time with the chair or the dean? There are all of these status quo things going on. And when we have the habitus, when we have the status quo, we really want to keep it there. And anytime we get a sense of someone disrupting the habitus, we get very uncomfortable with that. Again, these are all these ways that we're sensing if somebody is acting outside of that habitus, we have a real response that happens inside of us. And that could come out as defensive emotions. We could be angry. Again, calling back to some of our discomfort if folks were feeling a little bit angry about just some of the concepts that we're hearing. That is the habitus being disrupted in the most minute sense. We could become fearful. Maybe we could become guilty. And it comes out as some behaviors. We can become argumentative. Again, that sense of defensiveness where folks may have felt the inclination to argue with some of the concepts that I've raised. Again, that is a naturally occurring process when we start to feel that someone is calling into question the status quo, which is not to be confused with the way that things should be. It's just the way that they are right now. And so we might argue, we might be the opposite and be silent, and we might even leave the situation. And so the example that I used to give was the example of the backlash of Me Too, where as a direct reaction to that, we heard a lot of men say, of course, not all men, we're not trying to make broad strokes here, but we heard many men say, well, then fine, I'm just not going to mentor women. And that is that direct example of saying, fine, I'm leaving the situation because you are disrupting what I know to be the status quo. I think we are seeing a direct, more tangible example of defensive behavior around leaving the stress-inducing situation by making all of these kinds of conversations illegal and not allowed to happen. That is the ultimate response of confronting the habitus. And so when that happens and when those emotions and behaviors come out, all of that reinstates those power equilibriums and that dominant culture all over again. Again, dominant culture perpetuates itself, recreates itself through these power dynamics. And so how that translates into our organizations again, and I think it's a little bit of an old book at this time. I'm wondering if they're going to come out with I think maybe they did come out with another version. This is the 4th edition. I don't know if there's a 5th edition out, but this idea of the meritocracy myth, which again, I didn't plan it this way. I've had this slide for years now in terms of how we started to talk about merit. But our organizations have talked about merit for many, many years, for always, when in reality, merit really is more often measuring how you fit into the dominant culture, not necessarily merit, because who actually creates those systems of which merit is predicated upon. And I realize that this is a very divisive issue. This creates a lot of emotions for folks because you have worked really, really hard to get where you are. Nobody's discounting that. And we can simultaneously understand how there are structures within our systems that are based off of a dominant culture. And so one way that I like to think about this is to give the example of a factory. And so imagine that we have a factory and everything in that factory was designed for right-handed people. The buttons that you have to push, the screens, the conveyor belts on the right side, the handrails to go up the stairs are on the right side. The elevator button, absolutely everything that you can imagine is designed for right-handed people. And that is defined as merit, if you can do things well within the system. Imagine you have someone who is left-handed that comes into this factory to work. They're not going to be as successful, right? Not because they're not as smart or talented or brilliant or have great training. It's because the system wasn't designed for them. And again, that system is the dominant culture system that we're trying to get people to think about. And so in our equity-minded systems, this really begs some critical questions for those of us who have privileged identities, like being white or being a man or being cisgendered, able-bodied. If we are trying to reposition these systems so that they are fairer, they are more equitable, that means we do have to change. And if we are changing things to make them more equitable, that means we have to actually redistribute some power. And so we have to be willing to ask ourselves, those of us who have identities of advantage, about what power we're willing to give up. And that we have to believe that redistributing that power among everyone is going to lift everyone up, that I will also benefit from giving up that power. And I think it's really important to point out that power can mean a lot of different things, because so often people immediately jump to, well, I'm not going to give up my position, my clerkship director position, just so someone else can have it. Power can be a lot of different things. It can be voice, it can be agency, comfort, decision-making, participation, trust. We have to even think about power in different ways so that we can start to realign some of our organizations. And that is really this idea of inclusive culture. And we have had, and we have to understand this point of how it will benefit everyone. I have to believe that making things fairer and more equitable is also going to benefit me, is going to benefit everyone. And we know that the research bears that out, right? There are many books, many articles on that bottom line value of DEI practices. And so we have to be really clear about the value of employing equitable and inclusive practices, and that it is not about lowering standards, as some people have recently suggested, but it is changing our ways of looking at our systems that don't only value dominant culture traits so that we can have better work. And again, we know from all of the research that organizations exceed or meet financial targets, are going to be high performing. They're going to be more innovative and agile. Teams are going to make better decisions. They may not be made quite as fast, but you're going to ultimately make better decisions. And so that really gives us some of that impetus to want to create those more inclusive cultures. And so getting more specific about what that really means, we can think about how does it actually translate into organizational changes. We've got one place to potentially start is thinking about some of the things that we value. And when I say value, I mean reward. And so on the left-hand side, we have some values. Or some ways of working in academic medicine. Again, these come from various dominant cultural sets, but we've got competition, hyper-individualism, overconfidence, this false sense of urgency that absolutely everything needs to be done right now, that it's the lone genius that comes up with the amazing Nobel, grant. When we could value and thereby, when I say value, reward different ways of being and different ways of working, focusing on collaboration, on partnership, being more questioning and thoughtful about, I don't know the answer, I'm not quite sure, maybe we need to take some time and think about this more, and really focusing on that collective genius. And so there are some questions that we can use and that we can start. Again, we want to think about where can we start as organizations. And we mentioned it earlier, we need to start by having the conversation. Because if we don't have these conversations, we are allowing ourselves to just accept what the dominant culture has set out as a good employee, a good leader, all of the above. And so have we ever talked about these things, about what are the characteristics of a good employee? And what that actually means outside of some of the core competencies that we probably have as part of our annual reviews, right? That you're collaborative, that you perform your job metrics, all that. But what are those actual characteristics? And how do we know? What types of things are rewarded? Is there encouragement to compete for resources, which are increasingly scarce? Or how do we value collaborations? What behaviors do we consider uncomfortable? Raising conflict in public, or maybe having a louder voice, maybe crying in a meeting. How do we all respond when these things happen? Who's included in the decision-making process? Again, these are just some of the questions that we can start with to start to confront these dominant culture assumptions and norms that are maybe not serving everybody. And so just to wrap us up at the very end, and then we've got a couple minutes for questions. But there are some other ways that we can create that sense of belonging. And this is definitely needs to be set from the top, but we want everyone to feel like as an individual, I feel like I get a sense of how I can create belonging in the workplace. As an individual contributor, what is something that I can actually do? And it might be just as simple as not assuming certain things, of just the comments that we say of, well, everybody hates chocolate, when in reality, that may not be the case. And I'm using a silly example. I love chocolate, by the way. But it might be something else that we just, again, take for granted and not realizing that we're making those assumptions in our language. Or on the other side, it might be as simple as saying, I really appreciate how you phrased that, or I really appreciated how you showed emotion, or how your passion came through in the meeting. That's another way that we can value and reward different ways of being. And when people show up as their authentic selves, or to the extent that they feel comfortable too, that's a way that we can also value and reward it. And so creating that sense of belonging at the individual or leadership level looks like creating that psychologically safe space. That really does have to come in from the leadership level and be set from the top. We can check in with people. We're increasingly separated and isolated by our technology these days. And so stopping by people's offices and just checking in with folks is a way that we can help people feel like, again, it is something they perceive, it's something that they feel. And when we check in with folks, that can really help that sense of belonging. Giving voice to those folks who feel like maybe they can't always speak up, or amplifying their points or their comments when we're in meetings, encouraging those employee-led communities and giving people agency, asking people for input. Feel free to give me some feedback. How much are we actually extending that olive branch to others. And then celebrating that self-identity. We've talked about this before a little bit, of some organizations starting to really celebrate that we're coming into each space as a full human with lots of different identities. And the more that we can vocalize that and we can really talk about that, makes it easier for folks to really feel like they belong. All right, we've got just a couple of minutes for other questions. I know we got started just a little bit late, so apologies for that we didn't get more time for questions, but would love to take any questions that folks might have. Or reflections. Would happy to hear people's reflections as well.
Thank you, Diana, for another wonderful talk. I guess I get to start. I guess sort of like one of the things that I think about, especially now with sort of like the revamp of sort of approaches to sort of like diversity, equity, and inclusion, but sort of like going back, sort of asking questions that sort of confront dominant culture also has a necessity for the recognition of understanding where your biases are, because if everyone in the room sort of goes like, what's a great employee? And the answer is, well, everyone just like us, and everyone in the room is the same, then like, great, we're done and move on. So sort of like the impetus of like, how do you like the carrot or the stick to get people to actually self-examine when that's going to push them out of their comfort zones, like how do we sort of address that, and then sort of going forward thinking about it when there's sort of like the pendulum swing away from the fact that a lot of like the chipping away at this to get people to start to actually pay attention to it is now sort of, you know being erased.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I have a lot of thoughts about it, but I want to be mindful of people's time. A really initial answer, quick answer, is just getting people to actually talk about little parts of themselves. And we don't make a lot of time for vulnerability. I've probably said that before. We don't make a lot of time for vulnerability in academic medicine. And so even having people do something like the Strengths Finder self-assessment or MBTI. I know people have lots of feelings about different personality tests, but I think we come into work almost with this veneer of, we don't get to share a lot about how complex we are. Again, even for those folks who are in the dominant culture, we have complexity to ourselves as well. And so just getting folks to even all come together as a team and say, well, I'm an ENFP. Well, I'm an ITMJ. If you're a Myers-Briggs person, or the Strength Finder, I'm more of, a curious person. Oh, well, I'm somebody who really likes to achieve results. Starting there sometimes I think can be helpful, of just starting to get the language around describing the differences that we might have and what those differences really bring to the table.
Thank you.
So I know we went a little bit over time. I just want to remind folks, thank you for coming today. And our next session is going to be in person on May 1st. Same time, not same place. But I hope that folks can come in person. We had a fun time with the 5 of us in the room last time. So there is food. Maybe I'm making a false promise, but last time there was food. So if people want to come in person, it will be much warmer than last time. So it would be great to see people in person. Hope everyone has a fantastic rest of your day, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much, Diana. Thank you, everyone, for your
Thanks,
time.
everyone. Bye-bye.